Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
In the last few seconds, another building, building number 7, one of the buildings in support of the World Trade Center towers, has collapsed. This is no small building, as you can see, at 47 stories. It would stand out in most American cities.
This is building 7 in the World Trade Center area is collapsing. Now, whether we don't even know whether this was something that was engineered for safety reasons, or it just happened as a consequence of the 2 collisions this morning.
World Trade Center Building Number 7. On September 11, 2001, it was one of the casualties of the terrorist attacks on that horrific day. Building 7's sudden and shocking collapse has been overshadowed by the fate of the Twin Towers. But from an engineering standpoint, it is the greater mystery.
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed. We being the team that investigated what occurred on that day. There was some damage to Tower 7 caused by the debris that hit it from Tower 1, but the damage was certainly not similar in scope or magnitude to that caused by the aircraft hitting Towers 1 and 2.
The only positive aspect of this building's demise is that it fell 7 hours after the 2 main towers. Everyone had been evacuated, and even though the 47-story building collapsed in on itself in under 10 seconds, no one was killed.
World Trade Center 7 was completed in 1987. It had approximately 1.8 million square feet, 47 stories, and was roughly 600 feet tall. Each of the floors was approximately 40,000 square feet, which is roughly the size of a football field and equal to the size of the floor plate on each of the towers.
The building was a good building. It was soundly designed. It would still be standing if not for 9/11. And it was state-of-the-art at the time, absolutely.
I lost my husband.
My son.
My uncle.
My nephew. On September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know a 3rd tower fell that day.
The government says fire brought it down.
The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires.
I, along with 1,400 other architects and engineers,
have found the government's conclusion to be physically impossible.
Impossible.
We need the truth about what happened that day.
Go to rememberbuilding7.org.
Why it fell, why it matters, and what you can do.
Do you believe that the government had anything to do with the attack of 9/11? Do you believe in a conspiracy in terms of the attack of 9/11?
No, but I do believe that it is the first time in history that fire has ever melted steel. I do believe that it defies physics for the World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7, which collapsed in on itself. It is impossible for a building to fall the way it fell without explosives being involved. World Trade Center 7. World Trader 1 and 2 got hit by planes. 7, miraculously, the first time in history, steel was melted by fire. It is physically impossible.
And who do you think is responsible for that?
I have no idea. But to say that we don't know that it imploded and it was an implosion and a demolition is beyond ignorant. Look at the films, get a physics expert here from Yale, from Harvard, pick the school. It defies reason.
Let's get one. Let's get one, because that
I would do it.
Is the unthinkable.
It is the unthinkable. But imagine if somebody could convince you of that, could prove it to you, Elizabeth. Just 7.
Did you know that a 3rd tower fell on 9/11? At approximately 5:20 p.m. on September 11, 2001, World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed in 6.5 seconds. from normal office fires, according to the government's final report.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
Later, the government finally admitted that Building 7 collapsed at the rate of free fall, after trying to deny it. So what's wrong with a building in free fall? What is free fall?
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet.
This is high school physics.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
The only way that a building can accelerate as it collapses is by having pre-engineered, precisely timed, and precisely placed explosives. In other words, controlled demolition.
I got it.
When you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I've designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1-shell and 2-shell here in Houston. I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
Saw the big hubbub going on around Building 7. Walked around it. I saw a hole. I didn't see a hole bad enough to knock a building down, though. saw, yeah, there was definitely fire in the building, but I didn't hear any, maybe this is movie crap. I didn't hear any creaking, or I didn't hear any indication that it was going to come down. And all of a sudden, the radios exploded, and everybody started screaming, "Get away, get away, get away from it!" And I was like a deer in the headlights, and I look up, and I think I remember pretty clearly the two guys that I knew were on the transit radio. I don't know if those tapes are out there, but I can try and look for them and show you exactly what I'm talking about. But it was that moment, get away, and I looked up, and it was nothing I would ever imagine seeing in my life. The thing started peeling in on itself, and I mean, there was an umbrella of crap 7 feet over my head that I just stared at, and somebody grabbed my shoulder, and I started running, and the shit's hitting the ground behind me, and the whole time you're hearing thum, 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 thum. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it. I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and running away from that sucked. That's one of the things that I live with all the time, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
The Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building, they just said bringing a building down.
All I can attest to is that by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department, and they did use the word, we're going to have to bring it down.
Keep your eye on that building, it'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up.
So we're like, okay, we'll take their word for it. We'll stay behind the line. And he went over and he talked to one of the, through all the commotion, he goes over and he asked one of the Red Cross, or one of the firefighters, what was going on. I guess, I don't know if he got an answer or not. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something? Right now. You gotta get back from here. I know that. You gotta get back. All right. Don't worry about me. You need to make calls right now. All right, let's go. We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
New York City, 2001. No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th. According to a 3-year comprehensive building and fire safety investigation just completed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we have shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
NIST used detailed data describing the building and its contents to create the most complex computer simulation of a structure collapse ever made. Falling debris from Tower 1 started fires on 10 floors in Building 7. A break in the city water main from the collapse of the towers disabled sprinklers in the lower half of WTC 7, allowing fires on those floors to burn for 7 hours. The NIST computer model was validated with evidence from videos, photos, witness accounts, and other data. It shows that heat from fires expanded long support beams, causing connections and floors to fail.
So you look at the floors failing here, and eventually this column 79 is going to buckle, it fails, and then the entire vertical progression takes place.
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse.
And clearly a more asymmetrical pattern should have been present.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside, at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
The buckled column caused additional collapsed floors and falling debris that removed support from adjacent interior columns. A chain reaction then caused other interior columns to fail in quick succession. The outside shell of the building fell.
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdome, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Key Span gas holders in New York. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. That's another indicator that this NIST report is very suspect.
When it's all finished, the outside walls are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building. Just like a house of cards if it were coming down.
As a structural engineer, I don't believe that the failure of one column would normally bring down an entire building in the way we saw World Trade Center 7 come down.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense.
The NIST team found no evidence that explosives were involved in the collapse.
And our analysis showed that even the smallest explosive charge that was capable of bringing down the critical column in the building, had it occurred, we would have seen sound levels of 120 to 130 decibels about a half a mile away. That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
In its final report on the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, went out of its way to avoid investigating the use of explosives. Their sole rationale for not investigating explosive use was the supposed lack of sufficiently loud sounds. NIST computed what they claimed would be the minimum loudness of an explosion that could sever Column 79 with a single blast. Then they claimed no observers detected explosions as loud as their predictions.
This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
On the basis of this artificial threshold of interest, they swept aside all evidence of actual explosions and concluded that no explosives contributed to the destruction of the building.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7.
Yet there was voluminous evidence of explosions.
Here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
You heard explosions, like boom.
We just heard one more explosion. That's about the fourth one we've heard.
A few blocks up West Broadway, looking toward the World Trade Center in the distance, Ashley Banfield was conducting an interview for MSNBC.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your...
The mic was set to pick up speech a few inches away. From the involuntary startle response,
oh my God,
we know explosions are being heard. However, listening closely, we discover that the microphone did indeed pick up the sounds of explosions, but very faintly. Turn up the volume. Listen for a low rumble in the background.
you were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here.
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God.
This time the sound has been filtered to emphasize low frequencies. Listen for booms like a bass drum in the distance.
In fact, you were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. You've got Carolina here. They advised us to leave because we have... Oh my God.
Here's a different version filtered to emphasize the mid-range sounds. The bass drum is gone. I would describe the blast sound like a train on a bumpy track.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here.
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God.
Here's the original sound again.
You were just told by police that you should move out of your apartment, Fabiana. Yes. You've got Carolina here.
Yes. They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way. Please be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. No. No.
If you didn't hear the blasts, back up, use earphones, turn up the volume, and listen again. There were 2 blasts, followed by 7 more, regularly spaced, all in 2.5 seconds. Craig Bartmer's testimony may come to mind.
The whole time you hear boom, 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 boom. I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
When we hear the sharp, regular series of sounds in the background, the building has not yet started to fall. When we hear the reporters say, "This is it,"
this is it,
the building has not yet started to fall. The fall of the building corresponds to the crescendo in the crowd response. Here is another street scene with the building in full view. The crowd responds almost immediately as the building starts to fall. This occurs just after the reporter says, "This is it."
This is it. Oh my God. Oh my God.
Therefore, the blasts we heard occurred seconds before the building started to fall. When Ashley Banfield says, "This is it," it is because she has been previously told to expect Building 7 to come down.
The brown building, the tall one, is number 7 World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next.
Back in the studio, the anchor, Brian Williams, not only had foreknowledge of the collapse, he had a ready explanation.
What we've been fearing all afternoon has apparently happened. We were watching number 7 World Trade, which was part of the ancillary damage of the explosion and collapse of the other 2.
Just as Ashley Banfield was told, Brian Williams was told. There is indeed evidence that even the top fire officials were told.
We are on the phone with New York Fire Department Lieutenant David Restuccio. Lieutenant, where are you right now?
I'm at the corner of Northmore Street and Greenwich Street.
Can you confirm it was number 7 that just went in?
Yes, sir.
And you guys knew this was coming all day?
We had heard reports that the building was unstable and that it eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down.
Those in control of the story were planting the official narrative in our psyches in real time as events unfolded, using the press and even the fire and police departments as their unwitting agents.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing. And clearly those fires continue to burn at about 4:15 Eastern Daylight Time.
Building number 7 was going to collapse. That appears to be what has happened now.
One of those smaller buildings just fall to the ground. We had heard earlier that it was structurally unsafe.
We're getting word from New York right now that another building has collapsed. I understand that this is a 47-story building.
Information, of course, take a look at that right-hand side of the screen.
It's going down right now.
There it is.
Yep.
It went down right there. This is not from an explosion or an aircraft at this point, from our knowledge. The information that we have is that this is a building that probably was incredibly structurally damaged.
NIST is being dishonest.
That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to.
NIST was lying about no testimony of explosions. There was both testimony and recorded evidence of explosions. However, NIST discounted any evidence of explosions that did not exceed its artificially contrived threshold of interest. The minimum sound level of interest, as determined by NIST, was based on a blast of RDX, one of the loudest explosives available, large enough to break a major column outright with a single blast. They assumed no efforts at noise abatement, complete transmission of the sound to the outside air, no absorption or blockage of the sound along the path. And who knows if they assumed the use of an efficient cutter charge, or if they simply figured the effect of a bomb planted beside a column. They don't say. Their sole reason for doing this calculation was to create a pretext to sidestep any actual investigation of explosives. Why would NIST, or anyone else, choose to exclude from its investigation any evidence of any explosions related to the destruction of the building?
At the same time, it should be noted that NIST's report on Building 7 was never published by a peer-reviewed publication. This means their analysis of the collapse cannot be validated from a scientific point of view. Even though this was an unprecedented event in history, we are being asked by NIST to take their word for the soundness of their conclusions.
It's based on sound science, and it is consistent with all the observations we have.
But it has never happened before, right?
But the physics is consistent, it's sound, it's been analyzed, and we have the results. And we are very comfortable with our findings.
They might have been comfortable, but the scientific community of architects and engineers was not.
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
Architects and Engineers has asked NIST to at least verify the computer model on which they've based their theory of the collapse. But also in this case, NIST has refused to make their data public.
Structural engineers rail against NIST because they refuse to show the visualization. It's a black box. You cannot download any of this data.
This means that also for the accuracy of their computer model, we have to take NIST's word for it.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
This is the video of the event. On the right is one of the two animations released by NIST on the collapse of Building 7.
When you observe the footage of how the building failed, and when you look at the animation of the failure, and compare that to what you actually observe in reality, I think they disprove their own theories. It is impossible for it to fail the way they said.
The second animation released by NIST is even more inconsistent with the real event. While the animation shows a pronounced inward bending of the top of the structure, the video footage shows the entire top section of the building maintaining its shape all the way through the visible part of the collapse. This can be verified by different angles. If this is what NIST calls matching quite well, one can imagine what the reliability of their entire report can be.
In other news this week, the finding that allowed the National Institute of Standards and Technology to withhold data from its World Trade Center 7 collapse simulation has finally been released via whistleblowing site Cryptome.org. The finding was made on July 9, 2009, and reads in part, quote, The disclosure of the information in connection with NIST's investigation of the technical causes of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11, 2001, might jeopardize public safety. Therefore, NIST shall not release the information." End quote. Although the finding was made last year, the actual finding itself was not available to those who had requested the information, leading many to suspect that it would contain details of exactly how or why the data from NIST's WTC-7 collapse simulation would jeopardize public safety, but no such explanation is to be found. Analysts note the finding is especially odd given that NIST itself has claimed that the collapse of WTC-7 was an extraordinary event unprecedented in history, and that they arrived at that conclusion using the computer model whose input and result data they have now classified in the name of public safety.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires, similar to those we have seen in other tall buildings, caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fires. This is the first time that we're aware of that a building over 15 stories tall has collapsed primarily due to fire. We reached this conclusion by reconstructing the entire building, beam by beam, column by column, connection by connection, into a computer model, a virtual WTC-7 building.
Many are wondering whether NIST's reluctance to release their data is due to the questionable nature of the science underlying a simulation that many have pointed out is little more than a visual recreation of the initiation of a building collapse, which in itself explains nothing and does not even show the entire progressive collapse of the 47-story building.
In order to justify the first and only collapse in the history of a steel skyscraper due to fire, the debunkers have maintained that Building 7 was weaker than the average steel structure because it had been built over an existing electrical substation.
The building was extremely unconventional. It had this giant Con Ed substation with enormous trusses carrying extraordinarily high loads, very vulnerable to fire and other kinds of damage.
But NIST itself has refuted this possibility. From the final report we read, the transfer elements such as trusses, girders, and cantilever overhangs that were used to support the office building over the Con Edison substation did not play a significant role in the collapse of World Trade Center 7. In fact, it was the opposite. After it was completed, Larry Silverstein had the building reinforced beyond its requirements in order to accommodate the needs of its main tenant, Salomon Brothers. From this 1989 New York Times article we read, Salomon Brothers intends to spend nearly 2 years and more than $200 million cutting out floors, adding elevators, reinforcing steel girders, upgrading power supplies, and making other improvements in its million square feet of space. We built in enough redundancy to allow entire portions of floors to be removed without affecting the building's structural integrity, said Larry Silverstein, president of the company. More than 375 tons of steel, requiring 12 miles of welding, will be installed to reinforce floors for Salomon's extra equipment. If there was one skyscraper in the world that should have never collapsed due to fire, it was Building 7.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten?
Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Maar dit is ook op 11 september gebeurd.
Dezelfde dag?
Dezelfde dag.
Dezelfde dag? Weet je dat zeker?
Ja.
Was het zeker weten de 11e? Dat kan geen waar zijn.
7 uur nadat de World Trade Center naar beneden viel.
Ja? Hebben ze hard gewerkt.
In het officiële onderzoeksrapport van FEMA staat dat ze niet kunnen verklaren waarom gebouw nummer 7 is ingestort. Uitgebreid bespreken we alle mogelijke oorzaken met Danny Jowenko.
Dat weet ik niet precies, maar ze hebben wel...
Maar hij blijft erbij dat het gebouw is opgeblazen.
Het is vakwerk, zonder meer. Ze weten heel goed wat ze doen, die jongens.
De vraag is dan, is zoiets van tevoren voorbereid of kan dat op 11 september zelf nog zijn besloten en uitgevoerd?
Met hoeveel man heeft u hoeveel tijd nodig om dat te doen?
Dat weet ik niet precies, maar...
Maakt u een inschatting?
Ja, dan moet je wel ervaren mensen hebben, maar als je een man of 30, 40 zou hebben... Kijk, een paar met de snijbrander, de rest brengt hem aan. Andere mensen sluiten dat deadcord met die boosters aan. Dat moet allemaal precies op hetzelfde moment gaan. En weer een derde die zet de elektronische systemen erop. En dan gaat hij.
Terwijl overal brand was en ook in dat gebouw was brand.
Dat is niet geblust.
Ze hebben de brand niet geblust. Dus de mensen die dat moesten doen, die moesten het doen terwijl het binnen nog brandde.
Ja, dat is vreemd. Dat is vreemd. Dat vind ik ook heel vreemd. Daar heb ik geen verklaring voor.
Hi, my name is Barry Jennings. I'm 52 years old. I've worked for 33 years at one location. When the Office of Emergency Management did an activation, they always included our locale. And what they did was monitor the emergency. They actually coordinated the emergency through several agencies. I received the call shortly after the first plane hit. I got there, I had to be inside on the 23rd floor when the second plane hit. Upon arriving into the OEM EOC, we noticed that everybody was gone. I saw coffee that was on the desk. Still, the smoke was still coming off the coffee. I saw half-eaten sandwiches. And only me, Mr. Hess, was up there. After I called several individuals, one individual told me that to leave and leave right away. Mr. Hess came running back in. He said, we're the only ones up here, we got to get out of here. He found the stairwell. So we subsequently went to the stairwell and we're going down the stairs. When we reached the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. When I made it to the 6th floor and there was an explosion, the explosion was beneath me. Keep in mind now, it's pitch black in there. All the lights went out. So when the explosion happened, it blew us back. I'm thinking I'm standing on the landing. I'm actually holding on to a pole above us. And I had to climb back up because Hess is yelling, what do we do now? I said, there's only one thing we can do, and it's go back up. Both buildings were still standing. Both buildings were still standing. Both buildings were still standing. Keep in mind, I told you the fire department came and ran. They came twice. Why? Because building Tower 1 fell, then Tower 2 fell. And then when they came back with all concern now, like to get me the hell out of there. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down. All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions. All this time, I'm hearing explosions. When they finally got to us, and they took us down to what they called the lobby, because I asked them, I said, when we got down there, I said, where are we? He said, this was the lobby. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. It was total ruins. Total ruins. Now keep in mind, when I came in there, the lobby had nice escalators. It was a huge lobby. And for me to see what I saw, it was unbelievable. And the firefighter that took us down kept saying, do not look down. And I kept saying why. He said, do not look down. And we were stepping over people. And you know you can feel when you're stepping over people. This big giant police officer came to me. And he says, you have to run. I said, I can't run, my knees are swollen. He said, you're gonna have to get on your knees and crawl in. He said, because we have reports of more explosions. And that's when I started crawling. And I saw this guy fall behind me and his comrades came to his aid. They dragged him to safety. I'm just confused about one thing and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been one side of the building. Yes, you can use this footage.
Live and at large, it's the one 9/11 mystery that endures. World Trade Center building number 7.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down soon.
I do believe that it defies physics for the World Trade Center Tower 7, Building 7, which collapsed in on itself. It is impossible for a building to fall the way it fell without explosives being involved.
And if explosives were involved, that would mean that the most obnoxious protesters in recent years are right. If you hear this shouting, it's a group of demonstrators who've come. 9/11 was an inside job. Oh, get a life. Get a life. 9/11 was an inside job. Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Geraldo Rivera, and that noisy demonstration was more than 2 years ago. But the folks behind that TV ad you saw earlier are not so easy to dismiss as those demonstrators were. And what caught my eye is their claim that more than 1,300 architects and engineers examined the evidence about Building 7's collapse and disagree with the official report issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But up front tonight, Building 7 was no ordinary building. Among other key tenants, including several intelligence and law enforcement agencies, it also housed New York City's Emergency Operations Center, known as Mayor Giuliani's bunker. Here to tell us what they know about its collapse and why they question the official conclusions are Bob McIlvaine, whose son died in the World Trade Center, and Tony Zambati, a mechanical engineer. Nice to see you guys. Welcome.
Thank you,
welcome.
Geraldo.
Nice to meet you, Geraldo. Our condolences, obviously, for your loss. But Tony, let me start with you. You're an engineer. Are you suggesting that the official account that Building 7 collapsed because of the fire melting the steel or in some other ways, destroying the integrity, the structural integrity of the building, that's false? You think that that's false?
Yes, I do. And for a couple reasons. One is that Building 7 came down. It went into a sudden collapse across the full width and length of the building for 2.25 seconds, which amounted to 105 feet, or 8 stories, 8 13-foot tall stories. It was in full free-fall acceleration. That is impossible because in a natural collapse, columns would have to buckle. When columns buckle, there is a minimum resistance. It's asymptotic, if you know what that means. That means it never goes to zero. So it's impossible. You can't reach.
So here's what, I guess in layman's terms, to just get my hands here, Peter. So what he's saying is that the top floor collapses, hits the next floor, hits the next floor, hits the next floor. So it's bang, 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 bang. The weight of the upper floors.
It would slow down. What I'm trying to say is it was in full free fall acceleration. All of its potential energy was being converted to motion.
Instead of what I just described, the thing just collapsed like a pancake.
It just came down.
And so what are you suggesting brought it down, Tony?
I'm suggesting there was some form of demolition devices in that building for 8 stories or more.
You think that the explosives brought down Building 7?
Some form of demolition device. I'm not pretending to know what it is. I am saying that it was in free fall acceleration.
All right, let me ask you this.
NAST admitted to that.
Okay, let me ask you this before I get to Dad, before I get to Bob here. We've all seen old, obsolete buildings and public housing in other places outlive their usefulness, being demolished by the professionals who can actually collapse a building right in its own footprint. That's what it looks like happened to Building 7. Do you believe that's what happened?
Yes, I do believe that's what happened.
And why do you think they're lying about it?
I don't really know all the details of why they're lying about it. I can't read their minds. All I can say is, scientifically, it's impossible for fire to have done what we see.
And Bob, these 1,300 engineers and architects who agree with you and some of the other relatives' families. I know you found your son just a couple of days after the disaster. He was outside. I don't want to get into the details of how you believe he died. But these architects and engineers, do they support your contention? Do you believe that it was an inside job, that 9/11 was an inside job?
All right, Geraldo, I believe it was an inside job, okay? I'm here
you believe our government?
Right, look, please. But the thing is, we don't have enough time to get into the reasons of that. We set up this Building What campaign. We saw the...
Building What?
.org.
BuildingWhat.org.
The reason we have that is because Judge Lehner, when we had a petition to have a new investigation in New York City about Building 7. And when the lawyers...
And you're asking the New York City Council. I don't want to interrupt also to reopen.
So I know we don't have the time, but anyway, he said, Building what? Because no one has any idea about Building 7. So because I believe in... I've talked to so many firemen, so many EMS workers, policemen, who talk about the explosions. And I know you don't want to get into my son's, but I feel my son died from an explosion. I went to all the 9/11 Commission hearings. I've been researching this for 9 years.
So what do you want? Let's get to the bottom line before we're out of time.
I want truth. I've been lied to. I mean, it's beyond a reasonable doubt that the 9/11 Commission did not tell this story.
9/11 Commission barely mentioned Building 7, if at all.
Right.
Okay, what forum do you want the investigation in?
Well, the forum, what we want it is in New York City right now, because New York City, we feel, has an obligation to investigate 9/11.
So before we're out of time completely, Bob, do you want specifically the New York City Council to open its own investigation of the Building 7 collapse?
Absolutely.
And that would satisfy you if they did that?
Well, I'm not done. I'm still a parent. I'm a parent who has an obligation to find out why my son was murdered. As far as this show and New York City, I want the investigation. That will not be sufficient enough.
Your wound. I get that.
And I'm going beyond that.
But it's the beginning.
Of course it's the beginning, but that's why I support this Building What campaign.
Bob McIlvaine, we thank you. Tony Zambati, thank you very much. It is an intriguing topic. I certainly am much more open-minded about it than I was, and it is because of the involvement of the 9/11 families and all these engineers and architects. Clearly, they know more than I do. Thanks, gentlemen.
No, I always imagine myself making great plays, but you never think about being MVP.
Investigate 9/11. 9/11 was perpetrated by people within our own government.
All right. Is everybody all right?